Hey everybody, and welcome back to another lecture with Coding with Roby. And in this lecture, we're going to be going over our FastAPI routing assignment. So to read the assignment, we need to recap what we've learned so far. We will be creating a new route that has a lot of functionality that we have learned thus far in FastAPI. So there's going to be 6 steps to this assignment. The first step will be to create a new route within the routers directory called users.py. We then need to enhance users.py to be able to return all users within the application. Enhance users.py to be able to get a single user by path parameter. Do the same thing and enhance users.py again to be able to get a single user by a query parameter. Enhance the file to be able to modify a user's password by authentication, so we can change a password if the user signs in correctly. And then lastly, be able to delete their own user. So if the user decides they want to delete themselves, they will have that capability to do so. One thing I want to note is there are multiple different ways of how to do this in the exact code that needs to be followed to be able to implement these features. So if your code works, then it's good with me. If it matches perfectly with mine, well, that's awesome too. So with that, I'm going to jump in and get started. I'm going to go into my to-do app, open up our router directory, and create that new file of users.py. Inside here now, we need to do a couple imports. We need to start with the import sys with a syspath append of 2 dots. After this, we want to import depends and API router from FastAPI. We want to import our models. We will need to say from database, import engine and session local. From SQLAlchemy.orm, import session. From Pydantic, we want to import base model. And then lastly, from auth, import get current user, get user exception, verify password, and get password hash. All right, and after that, just ignore these 2 red lines of engine and session local. That is supposed to happen the way we are setting it up in PyCharm. All right, now the next thing we want to say is router equals API router. And inside here, we're going to say the prefix is equal to users. Our tags is going to be a list of just users. And our responses is going to be equal to an object or a map of 404 colon another curly bracket description not found. Afterwards, we want to say models.base.metadata.create all bind engine. And then we need to set up our DB. So we can say def get DB. Try DB equals session local. Yield DB. And then finally db.close. And now we want to set up our first API call. So with this, we can say @router.get, and we're going to make the path just an empty string, so just a slash. And then the function is going to be async def read all. And now we need to do our dependency injection of our DB, so we can say db::session equals depends get DB, and then return db.query models.users.all. So this query will return all users associated in the database. All right, and then after we do that, let's hop into our main.py file and add users to our route. So the first thing we're going to need to say is from routers import auth to-dos, users. And then right under to-dos.router, let's say app.include router of users.router. All right, we can save that, close the main.py file. I'm going to open up our terminal and I'm going to type in unicorn main app -- reload. I'm going to open up our browser, refresh the page, and we get a new API of users, which is to read all. It takes no parameters, and if we say execute, we get all the users returned, which is coding with Roby and our example user. Well, now that we created that, let's go and look at our next action item, which is now to enhance users.py to be able to return all users within. Oh, we already did that one. Now we want to enhance users.py to be able to get a single user by a path parameter. So let's add that right underneath our current function. And let's say @router.get. And this path, since it needs to be a path parameter, I'm going to just say /user/user ID in curly brackets. And the function is going to be called async def user by path, with the parameter going to be user ID, which is of type integer. And again, we need to do our dependency injection for our database, so we can say db of type session equals depends get db. We then want to say user model equals db.query models.users. .filter models.users.id is equal to user ID dot first. And if user model is not none, return user model. And now the alternative would be for us to return invalid user ID. Right, after I save that file, let's go back to our browser and verify that works. We now have our user by path where we can type in an ID. I'm going to say 1, which should return our coding with Roby because the IDs match. And now we need to do the exact same thing with using a query parameter. So for me to do this, I'm just going to do the exact same thing minus the user ID and just say /user. And then everything else should be fairly the same. So I'm just going to say async def user by query, user ID of type int, db of type session equals depends get db. User model equals db.query models.users.filter, where models.user.id is equal to user ID.first. And then we need to make sure the user model is not none. And if it's not, we can return the user model. If it is, we're going to want to return invalid user ID. All right, let's try this. Should be very similar to what we just did. So user by path, user by query, and let's type in 1 again. Make sure we get the coding with row user. Now if we go back to our code and go to our README. So our next thing we need to do is enhance users.py to be able to modify their user password if passed by authentication. So this one will get pretty tricky because we need to do some verification steps and pass in the user's password, and we're going to be using Pydantic for that. So the very first thing I'm going to do is at the very top of our page, right under our def get db, I'm going to create a Pydantic object of class user verification, which of course is going to take in our base model for Pydantic. I'm going to make sure the user types in a username and password and a new password of all type string, just so we can verify that, hey, the user knows their username, the user knows their old password, and they are verifying that they want a new password. So kind of a multiple different verification steps. All right, so with this new user verification, we're going to make sure that the user passes that in as part of their request. Okay, so now for our user password change function that we're going to write, we're going to make sure this is a put, just because we're going to be modifying a specific password. So we can say @router.put, and the path will be /user/password, where the function is going to be async def user password change. We're going to pass in user verification of our new type Pydantic class of user verification. We're going to pass in our user dictionary equals depends on get user. So that's going to be our verification step of the user being logged in. And then we want to say db of type session equals depends get db, our dependency injection for our database. First thing we want to say is if user is none, to now raise our get user exception. User model is equal to db.query models.users.filter. And within filter, we want to say models.users.id is equal to users.getID.first. And remember, we're going to use users.getID because user is coming back as a dictionary where we have to get the ID to get the value. And now we want to make sure that user model is not none. So we could find an item within our database table. So if user model is not none, then we want to do our verification of the username and password and all that to our user verification class that we just created. So to do this, we're going to say if user verification.username is equal to user model.username, and verify password from our authentication file. And we're going to be passing in our user verification of .password and our user model .hash password. And that's going to do some like reverse encryption of our bcrypt password to make sure that the password the user's passing in matches what we currently have in our database after it's unhashed. If all this passes, we want to say user model.hash password equals get password hash of user verification new password. So now we're getting the new hash and encryption of the new password the user passes in. We want to just add the user model to our DB, and then finally db.commit. And for fun, we can return successful. However, if any of this fails, we want to return invalid user or request. All right, so after we type this in, let's go to our browser again, refresh the page. And for us to properly do this, we need to make sure we are signed in. So we're gonna have to go up to our authentication of create user. And I'm just gonna create this user of username with all this information. Where that was successful, even though we returned null. So now I'm gonna just log in as string. Log in. We just got a token. Now we want to switch to Postman. Okay. And we want to go to authorization where we're going to be passing in our bearer token. And then we want to go to our body. And once we go to our body, we need to type in a username, password, and new password. So I'm going to say string. And then I'm going to make the password test1234 exclamation mark. Send. And we get a successful response. So now if we go back to our documentation, and let's say we want to sign in again, string should fail. And string test1234 exclamation mark will log us in with a new token. So everything's been going great. And now lastly, enhance users.py to be able to delete their own user. Okay, so let's go back to our users.py file. Let's create another API. Spaces. And now for this API, we're going to be using the delete functionality. So let's say approuter.delete/user async def delete user. We are going to be doing our authentication. So user of type dictionary equals depends of get current user. With our dependency injection of db of type session equals depends. And we're going to be passing in our get db. If user is none, raise get user exception. User model equals db.query models.users. .filter models.users.id equals user.getID.first. If user model is none, return user or request. So we're checking to make sure that user actually exists in the database. And then we're going to say db.query models.users .filter models.users.id equals user.getID.delete. And then finally db.commit, and we'll return delete successful. All right, now let's go back to our browser, refresh the page. What we can do first is make sure we can read all of the users, where we see our new fake user of ID 3. We now want to sign in with this user to grab the token. So let's go to token, string, test1234, exclamation mark. Grab this entire token. And we're going to say /delete, and this is going to be just /user. And we don't need a body, so I'm just going to say none for the body. And then authorization, we're going to have to swap out the token. And now send. All right, we got detail not found. So that means there's going to be a small bug that we need to fix. Oh, that's because we set up our prefix, so it's users/user. All right, now let's send it, and we can see delete was successful. So now if we go back to our browser and refresh our page, and we say read all users, we're now back down just to our original 2 users because our string, aka our third user, was deleted. So congratulations, we just added a bunch of stuff and set up an entire new router for our users. This is awesome stuff, and congratulations if you got that all by yourself. If you just needed a little bit of help, that's okay too. We're going to wrap up this lecture on this assignment, and I will see you in the next video.